nice to meet you in this space again. I'm Pastor Brenda. We're back here nerding about the Gospels. Tonight's going to be all about the unnecessary details that the Gospels tell. So before I explain that, I want to just give kudos to theologian Lydia McGrew. She has a YouTube channel, by the way, where she has just taught me all these things that have made the Gospels come alive to me and be even truer to me as I've read them. She has several groupings that she lumps her findings into. I just want to read them off to you. One is unnecessary details, which we're going to talk about tonight. We've already talked about those undesigned coincidences. There's also location, stuff verified by location, customs, and culture. Again, can be verified by historical documents. She also has unexplained illusions. I don't really understand those, so they're not coming up. Unexpected harmonies, like we talked about the Gospel of John, that the harmony between Luke and John about the story of the washing of the feet, that kind of stuff. And then unified personalities. So if you're digging this, tonight's all about unnecessary details. I invite you to subscribe, hit that like button. We just would like you to catch up on this series and go ahead with us. So tonight is all about those unnecessary details. These are the things you would add to a story because maybe you know the story is true. Maybe these are rabbit trail thoughts that you add to a story because you want to say that you were there and you remember this person wore that, or this kind of stuff. It's like the story is good without these details, but once you add them, the story either becomes more believable or more like, oh, he's on a rabbit trail, but at least I know he was actually there. These are the kind of details, and the Gospels are full of them that you would just probably miss, but now you won't, because this is why I've been loving reading the Gospels more since I've been learning these things. But with unnecessary details, liars also will add these to their story so that they become more believable. So then you wonder, did they embellish to be like the storyteller, the big mouth speaker in the room or something like that, or are they actually true? But what I want to show you with these unnecessary details is the gospel writers were true in the stories that they told, and they added in these unnecessary details like casually in their writing because they were there, they did the journalism, and these things are true. When it comes to the liars that add unnecessary details, they tend to be found out over time. Because that's what happens with lies, right? But here, our Gospels come out of a story that is over 2,000 years old. And the story's got staying power because it's true. So what these unnecessary details reveal to us, even to this day, is that what these Gospel writers tell us about Jesus is true. So let's begin with something that's called Solomon's Porch, which is a location in the temple. And John 10:22-24 tells us about this part of Jesus' story with these details. Are you ready? It was now winter, and Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. He was in the temple walking through the section known as Solomon's Colonnade, or Solomon's Porch. The people surrounded him and asked, "How long are you going to keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly." Okay, there's the scene. That first verse might be one of those ones we've talked about where you just kind of read over it without even thinking about it. But look what it tells us. It is now winter. Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of Hanukkah, the festival of dedication. What we know, according to archaeology, this would have been a very good time to be teaching from Solomon's Colonnade or Solomon's Porch, because that was a covered area of the temple. So they were in a covered area where the weather would be protected. And Jesus could teach longer there. So that little detail just told you that it was winter and Jesus was teaching there. And of course, but John just tells you it casually because he could actually probably see the story as he was writing it. But archaeology confirms, of course, this is where Jesus would be teaching when it was colder out. All right, here's another kind of crazy one. This is the funeral procession in Nain, and this is a miracle told in the Gospel of Luke, Remember, Luke was the journalist, did all this research to tell the story to Theophilus. And there's a miracle of a widow's son who was raised back to life, okay? This is the unnecessary detail. Nain is a town in Galilee, which is about 10 miles south of Nazareth. So this is that Galilean area. A few weeks back, we talked about this undesigned coincidence where the Gospels reveal that there was some disregard for the Galileans. They talked with an accent. This was mentioned throughout the Gospels. They were disdained. In our church, we talked about this on Friday nights, that Judea is like New York City and Galilee is like Mississippi. This was the disdain that the history writers had towards Galilee. So history tells us, particularly the Talmud, which is the Jewish central text for rabbinic Judaism, is that in Judea, the proper way, if you had a funeral procession, it would be the casket first. The mourners would come up behind the casket. But in Galilee, where they do things backwards, they had the mourners in front of the casket, and then the casket would come, okay? So Luke tells us about this miracle. It is a great miracle. It is a big miracle because it is death to life. And he gives us this detail of, soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. Notice they were first. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. So this is already maybe a hard to believe miracle, but all these details about the mourners going first in Galilee, Luke tells to say this story was true. He probably interviewed one of the funeral mourners in this and got the story and put the detail in that they went first, just to say that this happened in Galilee. This miracle truly happened. We never knew that before, did you? But now, right? The Pool of Bethesda. This is the story of the man who was healed waiting by the pool. He went there for 38 years. In our recently published Bible study called Trust Issues with God, available on Amazon, we take on day 1, week 2, we study this whole story and about how this man was healed and Jesus came, take up your mat. Anyway, I just encourage you. But there's a detail in the story that makes it even more interesting that didn't make the Bible study. It says in John 5:2, inside the city gate near the sheep gate was the pool of Bethesda with 5 covered porches. This covered porch would be like a deck. So of course a pool would have 4 sides, right? Not 5 sides. They weren't archaeological geniuses. Architectural geniuses, I mean. A pool having 5 sides seemed to be an embellished fact. In fact, what it came to be to make it understandable was that John wrote in this 5 porches to say this represents the 5 books of the law from Genesis through Deuteronomy, and that just showed the importance of Jewish law to the miracles of Jesus. That's kind of how they explained it away. Until 1888, and the archaeologist undug a pool near the temple, near the sheep gate of the temple. Here was this discovered pool that had 5 porches. It had 1 on each side and 1 across the middle. This unnecessary detail makes this amazing miracle even more true. Archaeology just makes it true. And John, he knew exactly where this pool was. He mentioned the 5 porches casually because that's what life was like when you were around the temple. You knew where this pool was. You knew what it looked like. That's just a casual detail that he just recorded for us. And we talked about last week in the Gospel of John about how John probably began writing this gospel when he was younger and just finished it up here in his old age. being that this was found in John 5, he probably wrote this story earlier, had an earlier telling of it, because he doesn't mention this, the demolition of Jerusalem, what happened when the temple was destroyed. And this pool of Bethesda was also destroyed at the same destruction, hence it was buried under the rubble of the temple. So it just kind of shows that maybe John did write this gospel over his lifetime, really focusing on like John 13 through the end of John in those later years when he really wanted us to know what Jesus had to say. But then you got to watch last week's video to get more about that kind of deeper thought in John. All right, Bethany. So Bethany is a town near Jerusalem, and it's mentioned quite a bit throughout the Gospels, noting that Bethany was near Jerusalem and about 15 stadia away, that's a measurement of Jewish time, or 3 kilometers or under 2 miles. That's relatively close to Jerusalem. So John 11:18 tells us Bethany was only a few miles down the road, I say from the New Living Translation, from Jerusalem. But notice it says a few miles down the road from Jerusalem. If you would walk that today, you would still go down the road to Jerusalem before you go up to Jerusalem to go to the festival. Geography matters. It verifies these unnecessary details that is just mentioned casually because they walked this road quite a bit to Bethany, which is why we know so much about Mary and Martha. It's mentioned frequently that Jesus goes back to Bethany because it was a short distance down the road. So here we have Mark 11:11. It says, so Jesus came to Jerusalem, went into the temple. After looking around carefully at everything, he left because it was late in the afternoon. Then he returned to Bethany with the 12 disciples. Why? Because that's where they were friendly towards him. That's where he could get a good meal, and it was just down the road. Unnecessary detail, but yet it makes the story come alive. It makes it sound more truthful because it is. Okay, remember the miracle of the calming of the storm. When the waves were tossed the disciples around and they were freaking out, and Jesus wakes up and says, peace be still. And they all say, wow, who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. That story, that's found in all 4 Gospels. Probably because they're all quite amazed by that story. And I don't know why all 4 Gospels got made some stories. That's the writer's decision making, but because they're writers still. But anyway, Mark tells this story and gives us 2 unnecessary details that are like why? But maybe we can talk about that in a moment here, okay? So in Mark's version of the story, he says in Mark 4:38, Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up shouting, teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown? It's almost like someone told Mark this unnecessary detail that Jesus was not only sleeping, but he had his head on a cushion. Well, everything's falling apart around them. I just picture that moment with me, right? Okay, why did he write it in there? I don't know, but it makes me believe it. And he tells this other unnecessary detail that has a beautiful twist to it. So I might preach a little bit here, okay? John 4:36, he says, so they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. Now think about this. We know from the other Gospels that Jesus just had the crowds following him, demanding from him, wanting more miracles from him. He had fed them, and now he wanted to get away, which is he had a practice of doing, right? So they got into the boat to cross over so Jesus could get away and have some quiet time. So it says here that although other boats followed. Doesn't that make sense if the crowds were bothering him, that other boats would follow? Unnecessary detail, but yet I had thought about that before, and that makes sense in the story too, doesn't it? So here's the beautiful truth about that. When the storm was freaking out the disciples, it was also for the other people in the boats. But they didn't have Jesus in the boat with them. So they were just in the storm, fearing for their life. So the disciples has Jesus to turn to and say, help, wake up, do something on my behalf. The other people on the boat didn't, okay? You also, this is a little preaching point here. You also can turn to Jesus in that moment and say, wake up, do something, God. This is what our Bible says about trust issues with God. It's like in that moment when your life's falling apart and you're wondering if God is for you, if God is with you, has God abandoned you, you can turn to God, beg, scream, yell. It's in the Bible study. And you know God will respond because your trust issues are growing in that direction. When you do that, your life is calmed. But think about this. So is everybody around you also gets the same calming miracle that you did because you asked. I want you to remember that when you feel like you need Jesus to do something right now and your prayers have become maybe a little bit demanding and desperate, pray anyway. Because Jesus will respond. You'll read that in the Bible study. He always answers yes in his way, and the people around you will also find calmness in their lives. Okay? To unnecessary details, pretty good perspective on that story, huh? All right. More of the Sea of Galilee. John, as we know, is a fisherman, right? So he says, just casually in John 6:19, Jesus, they had rowed 3 or 4 miles when suddenly they saw Jesus walking on the water toward the boat, and they were terrified. How would John know they rowed 3 to 4 miles? He's a fisherman. He knew that sea. He knew how far it would take to get across it, where to go, da-da-da. He knew it all. So he just put it in there. That's how far they were in the lake when everything went crazy. Fisherman detail. Also, the number of fish in the story in John 21, when this is after Jesus rose from the dead and the disciples were still a little bit disillusioned, they went back to go fishing. It says in John 21:1, so Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to the shore. There were 153 large fish, yet the net hadn't torn. That little detail, don't tell me that a fisherman doesn't tell you about every fish they have caught. That's what John did right there. He knew this was spectacular. He knew how many fish there were. He knew the net was spared because a fisherman would know that, right? Interesting. There's one more twist on that story. We know from the Gospel of John that John and Peter did do ministry together in Acts. There's 3 times they were in Acts, and then Acts gets taken over by the story of Paul. But John and Peter became ministry partners, and they became pretty close here. Yet here in John, we see John do a little bit of busting on Peter. And we also know from the undesigned coincidences and the unified characters that Peter's told the same way through all 4 Gospels, that the strong personality is not dissed on only in John, but he's kind of, anyway. John has these 2 disses for Peter that I think are pretty special I want to bring out. Again, in the same story, when they're out fishing, John 21:7 says, then the disciple Jesus loved, that's John, like we learned in the Gospel of John, said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped it off for work, and jumped into the water and headed to shore. An unnecessary detail other than to say, isn't it when you're on a boat, it's when you put your clothes on, but when you're going to jump into the water, you take your robe off? No. Peter was so disoriented at seeing Jesus on the shore, and we know what Peter's brain was like at this moment because he hadn't seen Jesus yet, but he had denied him last time he saw him. So he was like, Jesus is there, and he puts his clothes on and jumps in. John notices this and tells this story. For what reason? Other than to say, look how excited. I don't know. You see what I mean? Kind of a diss on Peter, but it's kind of funny. Yeah, I can't unsee that picture now. And he does it again also earlier in John 20, verse 3. This is the story of the resurrection, where we know the women found the tomb, went back and told Peter and John that Jesus was alive. And the John has to write it this way. Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Why is that detail necessary? Other than to say Peter was slower than John? Unnecessary detail. But if you think about this, we know that Peter died first. He was a martyr. And if John's writing this at the end of his life when he's back in Ephesus, he's probably reflecting on Peter. And then this close relationship that they had until Peter was martyred. And he couldn't resist sharing these little inside Peter nuggets as he's reflecting on his own life with Jesus and sharing about Peter too. It's just so beautifully personal, unnecessary, but really gives this gospel a twist, right? And then one more story that I hope to amaze you with is the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 is told in all four Gospels. The feeding of 4,000 is told in Matthew and Mark. Now, some historians like to kind of say that maybe these miracles didn't happen or they were the same miracle repeated twice, so we shouldn't believe the Gospels. In 2 weeks, we're going to talk about some of this distortion of why historians have made us doubt the Gospels. I'm just bringing you back to some really deep truths here to say these are true. Here again, I got a big truth here for you, an unnecessary detail that's just going to make you go, wow, this is true. Okay, so the Greek word for basket in both of those stories, it doesn't matter which gospel it is different. In the feeding of the 4,000, it uses the same Greek word as in Acts 9:25 that says, so during the night, some of the believers lowered him, which would be Paul, in a large basket through an opening in the city wall. So this basket was large enough to hold Paul to haul him over the city wall for his protection. It's a large basket, is how the English translates it. In the feeding of the 5,000, it just says the word basket. Different Greek word, it's just basket. But in the feeding of the 4,000, it says in Mark 15:37, they all ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up the 7 large baskets of leftover food. Mark 8:8, they ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There's that Greek word, 7 large baskets. These were human-sized baskets of leftover food. The feeding of the 5,000 had 12 leftover baskets. Unnecessary detail tells you these are 2 different miracles. Just a little bit more unnecessary detail. All 4 Gospels noted that there was 5 loaves of bread. In the feeding of the 4,000, they mentioned 7. In the feeding of the 5,000, the number of fish was 2. In the feeding of the 4,000, it just says a few fish. There's an unknown number here. The Gospel writers, which would be Matthew and Mark, didn't make up a number just to make it true. They didn't know the number and left it as a few fish. This wasn't embellished. This was just a few fish. But they knew it was 5 for the feeding of the 5,000. And just to go one step deeper, John 6:9 mentions that the loaves of the feeding of the 5,000 were barley loaves. Just one more detail. So there is all my nerding facts for the week. And it is my hope you're saying, this is the coolest sermon ever, or this is the nerdiest sermon ever, but I want to read the Gospels more to see if I can pick up on some of this stuff. It is amazing. So I'll be back next week talking about the Passion story, which generally is a solemn telling of this Holy Week. Of course, this week changed our lives. It gave us all this possibility of salvation. But next week, we're going to go to Nerding Facts. It's going to be a little bit lighthearted, but all about this great story. I will see you again. Have a great week.